As senior and lead analysts here at Procurement IQ, they are immersed in how the trends we discussed today are currently affecting and will impact procurement and supply chains going forward. Before we begin, I want to let all of our listeners know that today's presentation is being recorded, and afterwards we'll email the link to all of you in the next day or two. Okay, let's get started. Michelle, it's no secret that labor shortages are plaguing many areas of the economy. Construction comes to mind, for example, but they're also affecting procurement. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so in recent years, there's been a widening gap between supply and demand for supply chain and procurement professionals. Last year, DHL, which is the biggest name in logistics, released a study on the growing talent shortage and found that demand for supply chain professionals exceeds supply by a ratio of 6 to 1. Beyond that, somewhere between 25 to 33% of the current supply chain workforce is at or beyond retirement age. There just haven't been enough qualified applicants to fill that void.
So what's causing this talent shortage?
For starters, the industry is just growing too fast. There have been such rapid changes in import regulations, tariffs, and other supply chain risks that more people are needed now more than ever to manage what's become an increasingly complex business function. This rapid growth made it a lot more difficult to skill up newcomers in such a short time. There's really just no substitute for experience.
And does academia have a role to play in combating this shortage?
Yeah, so many people naturally look to education as an alternative way to qualify procurement professionals, but honestly, even then there are issues. DHL noted that full-time business faculty in supply chain management and related fields was consistently below 1.3% of all business faculty. And that's not only in the United States, but worldwide as well. So, with such a scarce faculty to teach students, procurement and supply chain strategies and best practices, it's really no wonder that there's a shortage in qualified talent.
And are there any negative perceptions of procurement careers that might be playing a role here as well?
Yeah, there's definitely this perception that procurement and supply chain jobs lack the excitement and the prestige of other verticals. And that's a big reason why there are fewer young people studying on a supply chain track. I think this stat is particularly telling. Of all the DHL survey respondents, only about 25% believed that their companies use supply chain as equally important as other disciplines. That's a pretty big problem when it comes to attracting talent because, people want recognition.
And how can companies and procurement departments start to fill these talent gaps?
I'd say to begin by giving this function the recognition it deserves. Company culture, attitudes, perceptions, they're all tremendously important when you're attracting new talent and also when retaining, the employees that you already have. So brand marketing is increasingly important when you're hiring. Companies should really be promoting a positive culture that regards procurement departments as highly as their peers. A good way to improve these perceptions and make these jobs more attractive is by investing in employees and employee development. So comprehensive training and development programs can help procurement departments in a few ways. For one, you're upskilling your staff, which creates more valuable employees. But moreover, it can reduce turnover by providing tangible benefits to employees looking to advance their career. There's a reason to stay, this perception of advancement.
Okay, those are all great actionable ideas. And let's just say worst case scenario, they utilize these strategies and they still can't find the right talent. Are there any other options?
Right, it's not always that simple. So a good strategy is to identify low value activities being performed by the procurement team and to pass those on to other departments. As long as there are clear guidelines, oftentimes, these smaller transactional purchases can be done by end users rather than the procurement team. I know decentralizing spend can be a slippery slope, but when it's done right, it can free up a lot of time for more important functions like strategy development and negotiation for key categories. And this also ties back to what I mentioned earlier about departments investing in employee training and development. A procurement staff that's cross-trained on a lot of verticals is much more flexible, and that's beneficial when you're dealing with a smaller than ideal department size. Lastly, you have automation. So just as I said, certain low-value activities can sometimes be passed on to other departments. There's also an opportunity to pass some other repetitive tasks, things like invoice processing, onto software that can automate the function. So McKinsey recently found that almost 60% of the tasks involved in the source-to-pay process could be mostly or fully automated using current technologies. That can open up a lot of bandwidth for a department that's overworked. And keep in mind, that's only current technology. There's also a lot of R&D in progress right now that's aiming to automate even more complicated procurement functions like identifying and qualifying vendors.
The topic of automation is, I think, a perfect segue into our next trend, so I'm glad you mentioned that. We're hearing a lot of technology buzzwords these days, and we don't have time to go into detail about all of them in this session, but I want to talk about a few that directly relate to the changing labor force in procurement, like you were talking about.
Right. So I briefly mentioned automation in reference to easing some of the burden on procurement staff. Robotic process automation software is a key tool to do that. You'll also hear it called RPA. So RPA involves using software programs to automate labor-intensive processes like purchase requests and approvals, invoices and payments, and some tasks involved with sourcing and vetting suppliers. The thing about RPA is that once it's programmed, the software doesn't require any human interaction. So, there's no doubt that this is applicable to procurement right now and can help to fill that gap if you're struggling with an overburdened procurement department, or if you're just looking to create more time to focus on strategic activities. Kind of the next step on the automation topic is machine learning. Machine learning refers to a machine's ability to continually improve performance without needing human intervention to explain how to accomplish its tasks. Basically, that means we can teach machines instead of just programming them like with RPA.
So it certainly sounds like there's a lot of potential applications for procurement. But can you give us a few examples for how a department might use machine learning?
Sure, yeah. There are a lot of tasks that it can help with. Machine learning can simplify contract compliance by scanning and storing contract data and automating alerts for renewals. It can improve contract negotiations by searching through your contract history to highlight opportunities for savings. It can help to run spend analysis reports before, during, and after a sourcing event to give you a more complete picture. The goal is really just to free up time for procurement staff to spend on high-value activities.
Okay, so there's two other buzzwords I wanted to get into that have been all over the news lately, and that is predictive analytics and artificial intelligence. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, those are definitely very popular topics right now. Simply put, predictive analytics uses the massive amounts of data that companies are generating daily to make predictions, to do things like forecast revenue and mitigate disruption, and also to identify different market opportunities. Looking at artificial intelligence, honestly, a lot of what people are calling AI these days is actually RPA or machine learning, both of which we just discussed. True AI looks for anomalies in data and actually learns your sourcing patterns and behaviors. So this enables procurement AI technologies to do things like, look for cost discrepancies or unusual order quantities or frequencies. It can also make supplier recommendations, predict market prices, identify and analyze vendors. Some technologies even help evaluate the success of supplier relationships. Realistically, though, predictive analytics and AI are probably too advanced for most procurement departments right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Just from your description, it sounds like there's a lot of technical understanding and advanced statistical capabilities that many companies might not just have in place at this moment.
Right.
But I'm glad we mentioned them because I think they're definitely something to keep an eye on. Before we wrap up this part of the conversation, though, I feel like we're missing a big one, and that's blockchain. Right,
we can't forget that. So we can spend an entire session trying to explain blockchain technology and how it might benefit procurement. Sorry to burst your bubble, but blockchain is still very much a developing technology, and it does carry heavy downsides like lack of regulation. There's slow and cumbersome transactions, and honestly, the mere fact that it's really hard to wrap your head around how it works. While blockchain, like predictive analytics and AI, holds a lot of future potential, you're probably better served by focusing on more mature technologies at this point.
Yeah, that's a great point. And on the mention of if any of our listeners want to wrap their head around blockchain as it pertains to procurement, we have a few articles written by some of our analysts that go into more detail and can help clarify this technology. So we'll send links to everyone after the presentation as well.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that there are other technology terms that you hear, and new ones will continue to pop up, but try to keep things in perspective and realize that you don't need to implement everything that you hear about. Technology isn't an end goal. It's definitely not the answer to all of your problems. Technology is really just a tool to empower people.
And on that note, are there any other takeaways for our audience when it comes to technology?
Yeah, so focus on programs and automating processes that will make your team more efficient. Leverage this technology to free up your staff so that they can focus on things like risk management and building relationships and strategic negotiating.
Okay, let's move on to another topic, and that's corporate social responsibility, or CSR for short. Businesses today are under a lot of pressure to adopt sustainable and ethical sourcing practices. Thomas, set the stage for us. What is CSR exactly, and how does sustainable and ethical sourcing fit into it?
Yeah, so sustainable and ethical sourcing falls under the broader scope of CSR, which is a set of internal policies unique to each company that encourage them to leverage their capital and influence to advance social and environmental causes. And what's interesting is that Procurement IQ has actually seen this on display in multiple custom IQ projects we've done. The most notable one that I can think of is a project that we did for a retailer for sustainable mannequins. And in doing these projects, analysts have consistently found that while sustainable and ethical sourcing can be more expensive, companies benefit from the positive PR that can outweigh the higher costs.
And what's driving all this renewed interest in companies' environmental footprint and how they source inputs?
Yeah, so the short answer is millennials. Millennials care more that the brands they're buying from are associated with causes they believe in. A 2015 Cone Communications study found that 91% of millennials would switch brands to one associated with a cause they believe in. That number is just 85% when looking at the US population as a whole. Additionally, more than 2/3 of millennials, which is obviously a dramatic majority, reported that they use social media to engage with other people about a brand's CSR initiatives. This means not only do millennials care about CSR, they will also actively share information and their opinions. Lastly, millennials are at that age where they represent a large share of the workforce and have access to disposable income. Also, as older generations age, millennials are also set to inherit upwards of $30 trillion in assets over the next 20 years. So all in all, their buying power and influence is at a high point right now.
Those are all incredible statistics. And I think just to add on to what you said, we live in an age now where information is so widely accessible, it can be shared instantaneously. This sounds like a really tall order for procurement professionals, especially given how complex and layered the global supply chains become.
Yeah, absolutely. Procurement departments are improving their processes to source sustainably and ensure their vendors are adhering to ethical standards. But as you mentioned, this has become increasingly difficult as supply chains have become more global, complex, and longer. So to avoid those pitfall PR disasters like oil spills, gas leaks, unethical vendors, procurement professionals are more closely scrutinizing their own supply chains.
Interesting. And I think that makes a great connection to Michelle's point earlier about making procurement more enticing for younger workers.
Yeah, it does. So CSR is an area that procurement could leverage to attract younger employees. Michelle talked about the shortage of talent and noted the negative perception of procurement among younger generations. Since millennials are so invested in the topic of CSR, highlighting how crucial procurement is to developing and maintaining ethical and sustainable supply chains could provide a way to draw in this generation and pique their interest in the procurement function.
All right, so given this shift, how has the idea of corporate social responsibility evolved?
So our idea of CSR in the past has involved photo ops with big checks between companies and charity or community groups. Today, though, we're seeing procurement departments act and measure their results to demonstrate they are sourcing ethically and sustainably. This has resulted in the uptick of the number of sustainability reports put out every year. So 20% of the companies on the S&P published these reports in 2011, but that number is up to 85% in 2017. Procurement has also been experimenting with some of the technologies that Michelle mentioned earlier, including blockchain, to increase supply chain transparency. Although to reiterate what she did say, blockchain is still in its infancy. So most applications are still in development or conceptual at this point, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on though. Overall, 2018 has been the year of increased transparency and accountability. The good news is that procurement is uniquely positioned to handle these issues as they seek to skill up their workforces and replace their retiring workers with younger workers who understand and value the importance of ethical and sustainable sourcing.
Okay, and if 2018 was the year of increased transparency and accountability, what can we expect going forward in 2019?
So I think one of the biggest pieces of news that will impact the next year has been the recent wave of newly elected government leaders. There are some regulations, primarily at the state level, aimed to encourage sustainable and ethical sourcing, but they do come with some loopholes. So there's a chance that we could see more effective regulations get passed. Additionally, as millennials continue to wield great influence, the high standards for companies to follow through on their CSR initiatives will continue to rise, thereby increasing transparency and the level of reporting. Procurement departments, though, should view this as an opportunity and work to improve the status of procurement within their companies. This could be an opportunity to really showcase a new direction for the function.
Thanks for that, Thomas. That was really insightful. I want to get into that bonus topic we alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, and that's supply chain risk, and more specifically, natural disasters. A few weeks ago, California experienced some of the worst wildfires in our state's history. This is an issue that affects all of us, and I think we know how devastating these fires have been for people who've lost a loved one or their home. But Michelle, they also present unique challenges to procurement work, right?
Yes, so these fires caused road closures, plant and warehouse shutdowns, flight delays, and thousands of displaced residents and workers. The location of some of these fires was a major factor too. The Camp Fire, which started northeast of Sacramento, it wreaked havoc on the Sacramento and Bay Area region, which has a high concentration of shipping and warehousing operations, especially for the e-commerce industry. Amazon was actually forced to close a warehouse in Sacramento due to hazardous air quality conditions, and the Postal Service also closed 8 offices in the region. So as California's fire season gets longer and longer, the wildfire threat will continue to grow in 2019. Supply chain professionals need to start factoring in a company's location and potential exposure to natural disasters when they're choosing a supplier.
Yeah, and I'm reminded also of the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in late 2017, which left Puerto Rico without power for months. And Baxter, which is one of the largest IV bag suppliers in the U.S., had concentrated its production on those products on the island, and no power. The country really faced, especially hospitals, faced IV bag shortages.
Yeah, and as a result of that shortage, price markups for IV bags reached as high as 600%. So just as with the wildfires in California, severe hurricanes are the new reality for Puerto Rico and the surrounding Gulf and Caribbean region. So buyers and suppliers in those areas should definitely take note.
And beyond natural disasters, I think 2018 also demonstrated that there are also man-made disasters that can contribute to supply chain risk. Thomas, what are some of the man-made disasters that are affecting procurement?
Yeah, Sean. So first off, we're defining man-made disasters as anything from terrorism to utility failure. But I think the most pervasive man-made threat has been cybersecurity attacks. According to a recent study from security firm CrowdStrike, 66% of companies reported an attack on their supply chain software. The average cost of these attacks was a staggering $1.1 million. But in my opinion, the most jarring takeaway from the survey was that a quarter of respondents reported that they lost customers to a competitor as a result of the attack.
And I think cybersecurity isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind when we think about procurement functions, but they're actually pretty strongly related, aren't they?
Yeah, so supply chain professionals are essentially hubs of sensitive data, which makes them prime targets for cyber attacks. Because they regularly handle large volumes of sensitive data, such as invoicing, pricing decisions. On top of this, cyber attacks are generally new threats, and they're going to continue to get more sophisticated. So just like how buyers need to start taking a more proactive look at a supplier's geographic location to assess natural disaster risk, Buyers should also be considering suppliers' cybersecurity capabilities when making purchasing decisions. This is likely going to involve getting IT looped in to help develop performance standards, as well as establishing processes to ensure that suppliers are meeting those standards. Buyers can also protect themselves by limiting the supplier's access to their IT systems. Suppliers that have deeper access to a wider range of the buyer's systems should be vetted and monitored more thoroughly.
And when it comes to limiting access to back systems, you actually have a real-world cautionary tale, right?
Yeah, so thinking back to 2014 with the Target data hack, there's a perfect example. In that attack, the cyber attackers breached Target's database through a third-party HVAC supplier. What is interesting is that Walmart used the same HVAC supplier, but they weren't impacted by the attacks. Walmart had taken steps to categorize and limit their vendors' access in a way that prevented hackers from gaining access to their data.
We'd also be remiss if we didn't mention tariffs in this supply chain risk section. Michelle, what are the takeaways for procurement in the wake of the tariffs and the ongoing trade disputes between the U.S. and China?
Yeah, tariffs have been a major source of disruption to the global supply chain. I think that, we in the procurement world have taken for granted the stability in trade relations that has marked the last few decades. And 2018 has showed us that that period is coming to an end, or at the very least, it's changing dramatically. The most obvious consequence has been rising costs for imported products, especially steel and aluminum, which were hit with the 25% and 10% tariffs respectively earlier this year. But there's also general political instability in the US and also around the world. And the uncertainty of what that means for business relationships going forward is a much more insidious problem that is causing a lot of disruption. So take Brexit, for example. Whether or not the British Parliament accept May's plan, there will be a lot of new legislation in the UK, which is going to change the distribution of duties and taxes on all different goods and services. New trade agreements are going to need to be hashed out, and the logistics of shipping goods to that region is going to change.
And with so much uncertainty over what the UK and EU will look like post-Brexit, is there anything supply chain professionals can start doing now?
Yes, so take a proactive rather than a reactive approach, and that's not only to Brexit, but that's to all supply chain risk. Procurement professionals should be looking very closely at the financial health of any British shipping companies they rely on to process and handle cargo that's traveling in and out of the region, because the UK is a really popular stopover destination for goods traveling to and from Europe. In fact, an estimated 40% of shipping traffic at British terminals is EU related. There's also tools to help supply chain managers be more proactive about risk, such as what-if costing. So that uses software to model different scenarios like what we've discussed here, such as the changes to duties regarding Brexit or the impact of natural disasters, to help companies budget and prepare accordingly. If 2018 taught us anything, it's that supply chain disruptions aren't a matter of if, but when. So don't wait for a supply chain disruption to happen. Take proactive steps to identify what can happen and prepare for those risks as best you can.
I think that's great advice, and that's a good place to leave this discussion. We've given everyone, I think, a lot to think about. Thank you, Michelle and Thomas, for lending your insight to our conversation, and thank you, everyone, for listening. We hope that you received some useful information as we head into 2019. And just a quick aside, for anyone who typed in questions, we will follow up with you individually via email, so look for that in the next day or two, and we'll include a link to the recording and the slide deck as well. Thank you again, everyone, for your time and interest.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sean.